ballroom looked like something out of a dream. Soft golden lights reflected off crystal chandeliers, and the polished floor shimmered as people moved gracefully from one corner to another. Waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks, and gentle laughter filled the air. It was one of those evenings where everything felt expensive, important, and carefully planned. At the center of it all sat a grand piano, shining under a spotlight. It wasn't just an instrument. It was the heart of the evening. Every now and then, a few notes would drift across the room, drawing attention back to the stage. And when the pianist played, the entire hall seemed to pause, as if the world outside didn't exist. He was well known among the guests. People admired not only his skill but also his personality. He didn't just play music, he entertained. He joked, teased the audience, and often turned his performances into something playful. That night was no different. Between songs, he spoke with confidence, making the crowd laugh with light humor. Music doesn't always have to be serious, he said with a smile, leaning slightly toward the audience. Sometimes it's just about having fun. Honestly, anyone can sit here and press a few keys. A few people chuckled. Some nodded in agreement. It felt like a harmless joke, the kind that kept the atmosphere relaxed. But in the far corner of the hall, near a side door, someone heard those words differently. She stood quietly, holding a cleaning cloth in her hand. Her uniform was simple, almost invisible compared to the elegance around her. While others wore fine suits and sparkling dresses, she moved carefully, making sure not to draw attention. Her job was to keep everything spotless, to quietly fix what others didn't even notice. She had been working since early evening, moving from table to table, making sure glasses were clean and floors stayed shining. No one really looked at her. No one asked her name. She was just part of the background, like the walls or the lights. But her eyes, for just a moment, rested on the piano. There was something in the way she looked at it. Not curiosity, but something deeper. Something familiar. She quickly looked away and continued her work. Back at the stage, the pianist finished another piece, ending with a dramatic flourish. The crowd clapped loudly. He stood up, gave a slight bow, and then sat back down, clearly enjoying the attention. "You see," he said, smiling, "it's not that difficult. It's all about confidence." A few people laughed again. Then his eyes wandered across the room, as if searching for something or someone. That's when he noticed her. She was wiping a nearby table, focused on her task, trying to stay unnoticed. A playful idea seemed to cross his mind. He leaned closer to the microphone, lowering his voice slightly, as if sharing a secret with the audience. "Maybe we should test that theory," he said. The guests leaned in with interest. He pointed gently toward the corner. "You there," he called out, his tone light but clear. "Would you like to try?" At first, she didn't realize he was speaking to her. She continued wiping the table. A few people turned their heads in her direction, and whispers began to spread. "I think he means her," someone murmured. She froze for a second, then slowly looked up. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was confusion in her expression, and maybe a little fear. "Come on," he said with a friendly smile. "Don't worry, it's just for fun." A soft ripple of laughter passed through the audience. She shook her head gently, almost immediately. "No, I can't," she said quietly, her voice barely reaching beyond the nearest table. But he wasn't ready to give up. "Why not?" he asked. "Didn't I just say anyone can do it?" More laughter followed. She felt the attention growing, and it made her uncomfortable. This wasn't her world. She didn't belong on that stage. She lowered her gaze, hoping the moment would pass. But it didn't. "Just come," he insisted, though his tone still carried that playful edge. "We all need a little humor tonight." The word humor echoed in the room, and people smiled, expecting something amusing. She stood still, unsure of what to do. Walking away might seem rude. Refusing again might draw even more attention. For a moment, it felt like the entire hall was waiting for her decision. Slowly, she placed the cloth down on the table. Her hands were slightly trembling. She took a deep breath and began to walk toward the stage. Every step felt heavier than the last. The sound of her shoes against the polished floor seemed louder than anything else. People watched with curiosity, some whispering, others smiling as if expecting a joke to unfold. She kept her eyes down, avoiding the crowd. The bright lights near the stage made her feel exposed, like she had stepped into a different world. When she reached the piano, she stopped. The pianist stood up to give her space, gesturing toward the bench with a welcoming smile. Up close, his confidence felt even stronger, almost overwhelming. "Take your time," he said. She nodded slightly but didn't speak. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the piano. Her reflection shimmered faintly on its polished surface. It had been a long time since she had been this close to one. Her heart was beating fast. She sat down carefully. The room grew quieter, the earlier laughter fading into a gentle silence. People leaned forward in their seats, waiting. She placed her hands in her lap, staring at the keys. They looked familiar and distant at the same time. Her fingers slowly lifted and hovered above the keyboard. Then they stopped. She pulled them back slightly as if unsure. A few people exchanged glances. The moment stretched longer than expected. The pianist crossed his arms, watching with mild amusement, still expecting a light, funny outcome. She closed her eyes for a brief second. It was almost as if she was searching for something buried deep inside. Then, quietly, she placed her fingers on the keys again. This time, she didn't pull back. The first note came out soft and gentle, so soft that it almost blended into the silence. But it was clear, clean, intentional. The room stilled completely. She pressed another key, then another. Each note followed the last with care, forming something delicate, something real. The sound was not clumsy. It was not random. It was controlled. And in that very moment, something began to change. The laughter disappeared. The smiles of amusement slowly faded into something else, something harder to describe. The pianist's expression shifted, just slightly. His relaxed posture straightened as he paid closer attention. Her hands moved a little more freely now, still gentle, still careful, but no longer uncertain. The melody began to take shape, like a quiet story unfolding one line at a time. And without anyone realizing it, the joke had already begun to disappear. The soft melody continued to float through the hall, and something about it made people sit a little straighter in their seats. At first, many of them were still unsure of what they were hearing. They had expected a mistake, a random pressing of keys, something to laugh at. But this was different. Her fingers moved slowly, almost carefully, as if she was testing each note before letting it go. But there was no hesitation in the sound itself. Every note landed exactly where it should, gentle and clear, like drops of rain falling in perfect rhythm. The room, which had been filled with chatter just moments ago, was now completely silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Near the stage, a glass sat forgotten on a tray, the person holding it no longer paying attention to their task. All eyes were fixed on the woman at the piano. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at the pianist either. Her focus stayed on the keys, but her expression had changed. The nervousness that had been there before was slowly fading. In its place was something calmer, something deeper. It was as if the world around her had disappeared. The melody grew stronger, still soft, but more confident now. Her hands began to move more freely across the piano, shifting from one note to another without pause. The music started to feel like a story, one that didn't need words to be understood. People began to feel it. One guest, who had been smiling earlier, slowly lowered his head, his expression turning thoughtful. Another leaned back in her chair, her eyes softening as if something in the music had touched her personally. No one spoke. No one wanted to break the moment. The pianist, who had been standing nearby with a light smile before, was no longer relaxed. His arms, once crossed casually, had dropped to his sides. His attention was now fully locked on her hands. There was a shift in his eyes, a small one, but real. He hadn't expected this. Not even close. She moved into a slightly faster part of the piece. Her fingers danced lightly over the keys, creating a rhythm that felt alive. It wasn't loud or showy, but it carried something powerful within it, something honest. The music didn't try to impress. It simply existed, and that made it even more beautiful. A faint sound of a chair moving echoed in the back of the room, but it quickly stopped, as if even that small noise felt out of place. Closer to the stage, someone quietly placed their drink down on a table, afraid the clink might disturb the moment. Her posture remained simple, almost modest. She didn't move dramatically or draw attention to herself. Everything about her stayed natural, grounded. But the music was something else entirely. Carried emotion, carried memory, and without saying a single word, it began to reveal something about her. A feeling of longing crept into the melody. The notes stretched slightly longer, as if holding on to something that didn't want to be let go. It wasn't sadness exactly, but it wasn't joy either. It was something in between, something real, the kind of feeling that made people reflect, even if they didn't know why. The pianist took a small step closer to the piano. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes followed every movement of her hands, trying to understand what he was hearing. He had spent years mastering his craft, learning every detail, every technique. And yet, there was something in her playing that didn't come from practice alone. Came from experience, from life. She shifted into another section of the piece, and this time the melody carried a quiet strength. It felt steady, grounded, like someone standing firm despite everything around them. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. There was no hesitation left. It was as if she had forgotten where she was. Or maybe she had finally remembered who she was. A soft breath escaped from someone in the front row, barely audible but filled with emotion. Another guest blinked quickly, as if trying to hold back tears they didn't expect. The music continued to build, not in volume, but in depth. Every note seemed to connect to the next in a way that felt natural, effortless. There was no rush, no need to impress. She wasn't playing for the crowd. She was simply playing. And somehow that made everyone listen more closely. The pianist's expression had fully changed now. There was no trace of humor left. Instead, there was something quieter, something close to respect. He glanced briefly at the audience, noticing how still they had become. The same people who had laughed earlier were now completely silent, their attention fully captured. He looked back at her, and for the first time that night he said nothing. The melody softened again, returning to something gentle and almost fragile. Her fingers slowed, pressing each key with care, as if each note mattered deeply. The room felt different now, warmer, closer. It was no longer a performance for entertainment. It had become something personal, something shared without words. A memory seemed to pass through her expression, just for a second. It was subtle, but it was there. Her eyes didn't leave the keys, but there was a softness in them, a quiet reflection of something from the past. The kind of look that comes when someone remembers a moment they never truly forgot. Her hands moved into a final sequence, tying everything together. The melody circled back to where it began, but now it felt fuller, richer, as if it had traveled a long way before returning. The last few notes were played slowly, gently, each one fading into the silence before the next began. No one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. And then the final note came. It lingered in the air for a brief moment before disappearing completely. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind. Not the kind filled with confusion. This was a different kind of silence. It was deep, meaningful, the kind that only happens when something truly unexpected has taken place. She didn't move right away. Her hands rested lightly on the keys, as if she wasn't ready to let go just yet. Then slowly, she lifted them. She placed them back in her lap, just as she had before. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. For a moment, she remained still. The audience looked at her, waiting, not for a joke, not for laughter, but for something they couldn't quite name. The pianist stood beside her, completely quiet. His earlier confidence, his playful energy, it had all disappeared. In its place was a quiet understanding that something had changed. Not just in the room, but in him as well. She finally looked up. Her eyes didn't search the crowd for approval. They simply took in the room, as if noticing it again for the first time since she had started playing. And in that moment, the distance between her and everyone else felt smaller than it had ever been. But the silence still held, as if the room itself needed a little more time before it could respond. For a few long seconds after the final note faded, no one moved. It felt as if the entire hall had forgotten how to react. The air itself seemed still, holding on to what had just happened. People looked at each other quietly, almost unsure if they had all experienced the same thing. Then, somewhere near the back, a single clap broke the silence. It was soft at first, careful, but it was real. Another clap followed, then another. Within moments, the sound began to grow, spreading across the room like a wave. Soon, the entire hall was filled with applause, loud, genuine, and full of emotion. It was no longer polite clapping. It was something deeper. Some people stood up without even realizing it. Others remained seated but clapped with both hands. Their expressions changed completely from earlier. A few guests even wiped their eyes quietly, as if they had been touched by something they couldn't explain. She sat there for a moment, slightly frozen, as if she didn't expect this reaction. Her eyes moved across the crowd slowly. This time they weren't ignoring her. They weren't laughing. They were looking at her with respect. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She stood up carefully from the piano bench, unsure of what to do next. Her hands came together lightly in front of her, almost as if she was trying to make herself smaller again. The applause continued. She gave a small, humble nod, then took a step back from the piano. The pianist, who had been standing beside her, finally moved. He stepped forward, but not with the same confident energy he had before. His movements were slower now, more thoughtful. He looked at her, really looked at her this time. Not as someone from the background, but as someone who had just changed the entire room. For a brief moment he didn't speak. It was unusual for him. Words had always come easily. Humor had always been his strength. But now there was no joke to make. "No one told me," he began, then paused. His voice sounded different, quieter, less certain. "No one told me you could play like that." A small murmur passed through the audience. She didn't respond right away. She simply lowered her gaze slightly, her fingers gently touching the edge of the piano, as if it still held something important to her. "I didn't come here to play," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something steady. The pianist nodded slowly, as if he understood, even though he probably didn't fully. "Well," he said, taking a small breath, "I asked for humor." He looked at the audience briefly, then back at her. "But what you gave," he paused again, searching for the right words. "That wasn't humor." There was no smile this time. That was something else. The room remained quiet, listening. She gave a faint, almost shy smile, but it didn't last long. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to change anything." The words were simple, but they carried weight. It was clear she hadn't played to impress. She hadn't played to prove anything. She had just played. And somehow that had been enough. "You didn't do anything wrong," he replied quickly. In fact, his tone carried a hint of urgency, as if he needed to make that clear. "You reminded us of something," he added. The audience listened closely. "Something we forget too easily." There was a short pause. "Why did you stop?" he asked gently. It was a simple question, but it shifted the atmosphere again. Her expression changed slightly. The calmness in her eyes remained, but something deeper surfaced beneath it. Something more personal. She hesitated. The crowd, which had just been full of applause moments ago, became quiet once again. "I didn't stop," she said after a moment. "I just had to do other things." The answer was short, but it said enough. The pianist didn't press further right away. He studied her expression, trying to understand what those words really meant. "You've played before," he said, more as a statement than a question. She nodded once. A long time ago. The way she said it made it feel like another life. Someone in the audience leaned forward slightly, listening more closely now. The curiosity that had once been playful had turned into something genuine. "What happened?" the pianist asked. This time his voice was softer, more careful. She looked down for a second, as if choosing her words. "Life," she said simply. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just acceptance. The kind that comes from learning to move forward without looking back too much. A quiet understanding spread through the room. Not everyone knew her story, but they didn't need all the details. Sometimes, a single word was enough. Life, responsibilities, changes, choices that didn't always feel like choices. The pianist let out a slow breath. He glanced at the piano, then back at her. "It doesn't sound like you ever left it," he said. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes returned to the keys for a brief moment. "There are things you don't forget," she said quietly. "And there are things that don't forget you." Her words settled into the room gently. The pianist gave a small nod, as if those words had reached him in a way he didn't expect. The audience remained silent, completely drawn into the moment. This was no longer about a performance. It had become something more human, more real. "Will you play again?" he asked after a short pause. The question surprised her. She looked at him, then at the audience. For a moment it seemed like she might say no. "I don't think," she began, then stopped. Her eyes moved across the room. The same people who had laughed earlier were now watching her with quiet hope. Not pressure, not expectation, just hope. She took a small breath. "I don't belong here," she said honestly. The words weren't filled with sadness, just truth. The pianist shook his head gently. "Maybe not before," he said, "but things can change." He stepped slightly aside, gesturing toward the piano again. "Stay," he added. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. The room felt different now, less like a stage, more like a place where something meaningful could happen. She looked at the piano again. This time, there was no hesitation in her gaze. Only thought, only memory. Slowly, she stepped closer once more. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the instrument. For a brief moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. The crowd didn't make a sound. No whispers, no movement, just quiet attention. She sat down again. Her posture was more relaxed this time, more certain. Her fingers hovered over the keys, just like before. But now they didn't hesitate. And as the first note of the next piece began to rise into the air, it was clear that this moment, this unexpected, unplanned moment, was far from over. The room stayed completely silent as she placed her fingers back on the piano keys. It felt different this time. Before, there had been hesitation, a quiet uncertainty in the air. Now there was something else, a steady calmness. Not confidence in a loud way, but a quiet kind of certainty, as if she had made a decision inside her without needing to tell anyone. She took a slow breath, and then she played. The first note came out soft again, almost like a whisper, but it didn't stay fragile for long. It grew slowly, spreading through the hall with a gentle strength. The sound was warm, full, and deeply human. It was not the same piece anymore. It felt like something new was being created in that very moment. The audience noticed it immediately. Some leaned forward again, afraid to miss even a single note. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound guide their thoughts. The pianist stood slightly behind her now, watching in silence. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't joking. He wasn't performing. He was listening, really listening. Her hands moved with more freedom than before. The earlier carefulness was still there, but it was now balanced with flow. Each movement of her fingers felt natural, like the piano was not something separate from her, but something connected to her thoughts. The melody began to shift, carried a feeling of memory. Not a single memory, but many layered together. There was a sense of distance in the music, as if it was coming from a place far away. but at the same time it felt very close, like something that had never truly left her. A few guests exchanged glances. No one spoke, but their expressions had changed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something deeper, something that made people reflect. The melody softened again, becoming slower, more delicate. Each note seemed to hold its own meaning before gently fading into the next. She tilted her head slightly as she played, completely absorbed. For her, the room was no longer filled with people. It was just sound, just feeling, just memory. The pianist noticed something else now. There was emotion in her playing that could not be taught easily. It wasn't about speed or perfection. It wasn't about technique alone. It was something lived, something experienced. The kind of emotion that comes from real-life moments that stay inside a person long after they happen. He took a small step back, giving her more space, as if he understood that the moment belonged to her now. The melody began to rise, slowly at first, then a little stronger. It was no longer fragile. It was building. The audience could feel it too. A subtle change in energy moved through the room. People sat a little straighter, their attention fully locked onto the piano. The music was telling something, not in words, but in feeling. There was a sense of struggle in it now. Not loud or chaotic, but quiet and persistent. Like someone walking through difficult paths but refusing to stop. Her fingers pressed the keys with more purpose. Not forcefully, but firmly. Each note felt like a step forward. The pianist's expression tightened slightly. He was no longer just observing. He was trying to understand. How could someone who was supposed to be just a cleaning worker, as the room had thought earlier, carry this level of depth in music? He shook that thought away quickly. That label no longer mattered. Not after what he had heard. The melody shifted again. This time it became more emotional. There was a softness in it that felt almost fragile again, but different from before. It was not uncertainty. It was reflection, like looking back at something that once mattered deeply. Her shoulders lowered slightly as she played, as if the music itself was pulling something from inside her. A memory, perhaps, or many. The audience felt it too. Some people lowered their heads. Others stared at the piano without blinking. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was understanding. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that arrives quietly and stays. Her hands moved more slowly now. Each note had space. Each silence between notes mattered just as much as the sound. It felt like she was not just playing music anymore. She was telling a story without speaking. A story that no one in the room knew fully, but somehow everyone could feel a part of. The pianist noticed a small detail. Her breathing had changed. It was steady, controlled, but deeply connected to the rhythm of the music. It was as if her body and the piano were working together as one. He had seen skilled performers before, many times, but this was different. This was not performance for applause. This was expression, pure and unfiltered. The melody began to rise once more. This time it carried strength. Not loud strength, but inner strength. The kind that comes after difficulty, after loss, after standing up again when life has pushed someone down more than once. Her fingers moved with more energy now, but still with control. The sound filled the room, not aggressively, but completely. The audience was fully silent again. No one dared to break it. Even the smallest sound felt like it would disturb something important. Her expression remained calm, but there was a deeper focus in her eyes now. It was as if she had gone somewhere far away inside herself, and the music was guiding her through it. The pianist glanced at the audience. They were completely captured. No one was distracted. No one was bored. Everyone was present in that moment. He looked back at her, and something in him shifted again. It was not just respect anymore. It was realization. He had thought earlier that he was in control of the stage, that he was the one guiding the evening. But now he understood. Some moments are not controlled. They appear, and they take over everything. The melody began to slow again, this time gently, like the end of a journey, not an ending in sadness, but an ending in acceptance. Her hands moved carefully, shaping the final part of the piece. Each note felt intentional. Each pause felt meaningful. It was as if she was placing something down slowly, carefully, after carrying it for a long time. The audience did not move. Not even a little. They were waiting, not for excitement, but for completion. Her fingers pressed the final sequence. The sound lingered in the air, soft and fading. And then, silence. Not sudden, not empty, but complete. The kind of silence that only comes after something deeply meaningful has been expressed fully. She kept her hands on the keys for a moment longer, as if making sure the moment was truly finished. Then slowly, she lifted them and placed them in her lap. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. A quiet breath escaped her. The pianist didn't speak. No one did. The room simply stayed still. And in that stillness, something had clearly changed. Not just in the music, but in every person who had listened. The silence after the music did not break immediately. It stayed in the room like something fragile that no one wanted to disturb. People were still sitting in their places, almost frozen, as if they were afraid that moving too quickly might take away what they had just experienced. The applause had not started yet. Even breathing felt softer than usual. She slowly lifted her hands from her lap and rested them gently beside her. Her eyes stayed on the piano for a moment longer, as if she was saying something to it without words. Then she looked down, not at the audience, not at anyone in particular, just down, quietly, like someone returning from a place far away. Behind her, the pianist finally stepped closer. He did not speak at first. He looked at her, then at the piano, then back at her again. The playful energy that had once defined him earlier in the evening was completely gone now. There was something serious in his expression, something thoughtful, something changed. He took a small breath before speaking. "I have been on this stage many times," he said slowly, his voice calm but firm. "I have played for large audiences, for important guests, for people who clap just because they are expected to." He paused. Then he looked at her directly. "But what you just did. No one claps because they are expected to." The words hung in the air. She did not respond right away. Her hands lightly touched the edge of the piano, as if she needed something steady to hold on to. "I didn't think anyone would notice," she said softly after a moment. A few people in the audience shifted slightly in their seats. Her voice was not confident in a loud way. It was simple, honest. The pianist shook his head gently. "That's the problem," he said. "People like you are usually the ones nobody notices, until it is too late." The words were not harsh. They were thoughtful, almost regretful. She finally looked up at him. For the first time that evening, she met his eyes directly. There was no anger there, no pride, only quiet understanding. "I wasn't trying to be noticed," she said. "I just haven't touched a piano in a long time." A soft murmur moved through the audience. That sentence alone made people lean in again. The pianist tilted his head slightly. "A long time?" he repeated. She nodded once. The room stayed silent again, waiting. She hesitated for a second, then continued. "I used to play," she said. "Not like this, not on stages. But I played a lot. Every chance I got." Her eyes drifted slightly, as if she was seeing something that wasn't in the room anymore. "Then life changed," she added quietly. No one interrupted. Even the smallest sound in the hall seemed far away. The pianist listened carefully. He didn't rush her. For the first time, he was not the one leading the moment. "I had to stop," she said. "There were responsibilities. Things that could not wait. Music. It became something I left behind without planning to." Her fingers moved slightly in her lap, as if remembering the shape of the keys. "I thought I would return to it someday," she added. "But days turn into years faster than people think." The room felt heavier in a quiet way. Not sad, just real. The pianist took a slow breath. "And today?" he asked gently. She looked at the piano again. A small pause followed. "Today I was just working," she said. "I didn't expect anything like this." A faint, almost unnoticeable smile appeared on her face. I thought I would clean the room, finish my work, and go home like always. A few people in the audience lowered their eyes slightly. It was strange how something so simple could sound so powerful in that moment. The pianist nodded slowly. I called you up here thinking it would be a joke, he admitted. The words surprised some people in the room. He didn't avoid it. He didn't soften it. He said it plainly. I thought it would be a small moment of humor for the audience, he continued. Something light. He paused again. But I was wrong. The silence deepened. He looked at her with a steady expression. What you gave us was not humor, he said. It was truth. She lowered her gaze again, almost shyly. I didn't mean to prove anything, she said quickly. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. No one is uncomfortable, he replied immediately. His voice was firm now but not harsh. People are just thinking. That made a few people in the audience shift again, quietly agreeing without words. He turned slightly toward the audience for a moment. When you play like that, he said, you remind people of things they have forgotten. Not just music, but feeling. He turned back to her. And that is not something to apologize for. She stayed quiet. For a moment, she looked like she didn't know what to say. The pianist softened his tone again. Tell me something, he said. If you had the chance, would you play again? The question felt simple, but it carried weight. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on the piano. It was as if she was listening to something inside herself before replying. Finally, she spoke. I don't know, she said honestly. Then she added, it feels far away, like something that belongs to another version of me. The pianist nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he said. But you still remember it, he said. She gave a small nod. Yes, that one word felt certain. The audience remained silent, watching the exchange carefully. It was no longer just a performance. It had turned into something more personal, more human. The pianist stepped slightly to the side, giving her space. You didn't lose it, he said. You just paused it. She looked at him, slightly confused. He gestured gently toward the piano. And today, you pressed play again. A faint breath left her lips. She looked at the instrument again, then slowly stepped back from the bench. Her hands rested at her sides. The moment felt different now, not like an ending, but like something paused in the middle. The pianist addressed the audience again, his voice steady. I think tonight was supposed to be a light evening, he said. But sometimes life doesn't follow plans. A few soft nods appeared in the crowd. He looked back at her. And sometimes, he added, we are reminded that talent does not disappear just because time passes. He paused. It waits. Those words settled into the room. She remained still, listening. The pianist gave a small, respectful nod toward her. And sometimes, he said quietly, it finds its way back on its own. For the first time since she had stepped onto the stage, she lifted her head fully. Not in pride, not in fear, just in quiet awareness. The room remained silent for a moment longer. Then, slowly, applause began again. This time it was not surprised. It was not confused. It was understanding. The applause began softly at first, like a gentle wave returning to shore. It wasn't loud or rushed. It was steady, warm, and full of something that felt close to respect. She stood near the piano, her hands still resting by her sides, as the sound slowly filled the hall again. This time it didn't feel like surprise. It didn't feel like entertainment either. It felt like understanding. People were not just clapping for what they had heard. They were clapping for what they had felt. She looked around the room slowly. The same faces that had once shown curiosity, then shock, and then silence, were now filled with something softer. Some people were still sitting. Some had stood up without realizing it. But all of them shared the same quiet emotion. The pianist stepped slightly forward, allowing the applause to continue for a few more seconds before raising his hand gently to calm the room. The sound slowly faded, not suddenly, but respectfully, as if even the applause understood it was time to stop. When silence returned, it was different from before. It no longer felt heavy, felt complete. The pianist turned to her again. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply looked at her, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he said, "I think tonight gave us something we didn't expect." She gave a small, almost unsure nod. He continued, "People came here thinking they would be entertained, maybe even distracted for a while." He glanced briefly at the audience, then back at her. "But I think they are leaving with something else." A few people in the audience lowered their heads slightly, as if agreeing without needing to speak. The pianist took a slow breath. "You reminded us that talent doesn't always stand in the center of the stage," he said. "Sometimes, it stands quietly in the background, waiting for someone to notice it." She looked down for a moment, almost shy again. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but firm enough to be honest. That statement made a few people in the audience react quietly. Some shook their heads slightly, as if disagreeing without wanting to interrupt her. The pianist also shook his head. "That's where you are wrong," he said gently. He gestured toward the piano. "What you did here was not ordinary." He paused for a moment. "It is not easy to touch people without saying a single word." The room stayed silent, listening carefully. She took a small breath. "I didn't know it would have this effect," she said. "I just played what I felt." The pianist nodded slowly. "And that," he said, "is exactly why it reached everyone." A soft shift moved through the audience again. There was something powerful in that simple exchange. No exaggeration, no performance, just truth. The pianist stepped back slightly, giving her more space near the piano. Then he said something that surprised a few people. "Would you like to sit again?" She looked at him quickly, slightly unsure. He continued gently, "Not for them." He pointed lightly toward the audience. "But for yourself." The room became very quiet again. She hesitated. Her eyes moved to the piano. It looked the same as before, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Now it felt like something familiar had returned after a long time. Her fingers moved slightly, as if remembering the shape of the keys even without touching them. "I don't know if I still can," she said honestly. The pianist replied without hesitation. "You already did." That simple answer stayed in the air for a moment. She slowly walked back toward the bench. Each step was lighter than before, not because the room had changed, but because something inside her had changed. When she sat down again, she didn't hesitate. Her posture was more natural now, more settled. Her hands rested on her lap for a moment. The audience watched quietly, not expecting anything loud or dramatic, just waiting. She placed her fingers on the keys. This time, there was no silence of uncertainty, only silence of attention. She began to play again. The first notes were soft, almost like a continuation of what had already happened earlier. But slowly the music shifted. It didn't repeat the earlier performance. It felt like a reflection of it. More personal, more calm. The melody was simpler this time, but somehow deeper, carried a sense of peace. Not excitement, not sadness, just acceptance. The pianist stood beside her, no longer trying to guide or observe closely. He simply listened. The audience did the same. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others closed their eyes again. But the feeling in the room was different now. Earlier it had been surprise. Now it was understanding. Her hands moved gently across the keys. There was no rush, no attempt to impress. It was as if she was not performing for anyone anymore. She was simply returning to something she had known long ago. A part of herself that had been quiet for too long. The melody flowed evenly. Smooth, natural. Each note felt like a breath. The pianist noticed something important again. This time there was no struggle in her playing. No tension, only ease. As if the music had finally found its place inside her again. The audience remained still, fully present. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the smallest sound felt unnecessary. The music carried everything that needed to be said. Told of time passing, of things paused, of moments returning when least expected. Her expression remained calm, but there was something new in her eyes. Not excitement, not emotion spilling over, but peace. The kind that comes when something forgotten is gently found again. As the melody continued, it slowly softened. The pace reduced. The notes became more spaced, like the end of a long thought. The pianist could sense it. This was the closing of something. Not an ending in loss, but in quiet completion. Her final notes came gently, one after another, until the last sound faded into the room. Silence returned. But this time it did not feel empty. Felt full. She kept her hands on the keys for a moment longer, then slowly lifted them, and placed them back in her lap. She didn't look around immediately. She simply stayed still. The pianist finally broke the silence. "This time," he said softly, "it felt like you played for yourself." She gave a small nod. "Yes," she said quietly. The audience began to clap again. But this time it was not loud or overwhelming. It was steady, respectful, and slow. She stood up from the bench once more. But this time she did not step back. She simply stayed there for a moment, looking at the room. No longer invisible. No longer just someone passing through, but someone who had been truly seen. The pianist gave her a small nod of respect, and she returned it gently. No more words were needed. The moment had already said everything.